Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Marasek, and this is my presentation on Chapter 13, What is Inside the Skin? Okay, so in our opening paragraph, Skinner makes a distinction between a behavioristic analysis and traditional mentalistic view. For the behavioristic analysis, he says that a person is an organism that comes from evolution, that evolution has left this organism with characteristics, both genetic and physiological, that come from having to survive for so long. And the organism then becomes a person, quotation fingers, after developing behaviors that have been reinforced over their lifetime. The behavior you're observing at any given moment is under the control of that environment. It's able to do this because it has been conditioned to do so based on the genetics that have been passed down through evolution, as opposed to the traditional mentalistic view, where a person is a member of the human species whose behaviors stem from a number of internal qualities that are not observable. And he goes on to list many of them, but there's too many. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple he put in there were dreams, instincts, wisdom, fear, and inhibitions. So these are not things that you can directly observe. For this comparison, he breaks down things into several subcategories. The first one is simplicity. And he says that he can't say that one is simpler than the other. And he does concede that behavioral analysis could be more complex, but some of the effects of them will be familiar. Use in control. Skinner makes the argument that no one has ever successfully modified an internal characteristic because you can't get to them. They're internal. He questions why someone would continue on with the process of mentalism if they haven't found real success in over 2,000 years, and feels that behavior modification has succeeded where mentalism has failed. Use in prediction. Feelings are related to events in your past and can serve as a predictor of future behavior. We should take into consideration a person's history when using feeling as a predictor of future behavior, and we don't generally inquire why someone may feel a certain way because we're too busy getting ready for the behavior they feel like doing. So if someone says, "Hey man, I'm about to punch you," I'm not saying, "Why is it that you feel that you're about to punch me?" No, I'm getting ready to get hit. And that attitudes, opinions, or intelligence can be used to predict behavior that is associated with known behaviors. And I think that is very indicative of our current political climate, if I do say so. Use and interpretation. Skinner believed that when you don't know the history of a behavior and you have a hard time describing it, you will have a hard time predicting a behavior or understanding why they are doing what they are doing. He also believed that a behaviorist will give a better interpretation of the behavior because they will think in terms of what is a person has inherited through genetics or look more closely at the environment rather than just rely on internal feelings. How far back? How far back do we go with this? If someone states they did something because they felt like it, we can't use because as a reason because it doesn't explain the feeling. I liken this to, when my child does something and I say, you need to go to your room, and they say, why? And I say, because I said so. It's not a very good explanation of why I just said that. Skinner believed that in an effort to not go so far back in the chain of events to explain why behavior happened, a mentalist will just stop at the psyche. We could go back and trace a behavior through infinite causes, but it does not make sense to go beyond the point where something can be done about it. So we don't have to go all the way back in time because there's really nothing we can do after a certain point. Skinner states that mentalistic views have declined while behavioralistic views have inclined. That include environmental contingencies have become more understood. Its relation to other sciences. Which position, mentalistic or behavioristic, works with both social sciences and physiology? To Skinner, the behavioristic philosophy works best. Social sciences used to be psychologistic, meaning that psychology was at the root of social sciences, and science being the key word in here. Concepts like the economic man and political animal that were used to describe human behavior were rejected because they were very simple and broad terms for describing behavior. I myself had to look up these terms. The economic man is a term from the 19th century describing someone who acts rationally in terms of economics. And they used it as a predictor of like markets and supply versus demand. But if you think about Black Friday, nobody is really rational. Political animal is a term first used by Aristotle to describe man as a social creature. Without social structure, though, they would be considered a loner or an outcast or a criminal. Skinner flips the script, saying that behavioristic view may look at the individual whose economic or political behaviors are functions of the environment. Behaviorists give tangible evidence for a physiologist to study human processes, whereas a mentalist does not give anything tangible, such as memories or consciousness, for a physiologist to study. And lastly, is this choice even necessary? I believe that Skinner is arguing for the legitimacy of behavior analysis versus psychology as the definitive science. He says, how can you have a physical event that leads to a mental event that leads back to a physical event? It doesn't really make any sense. This question could be avoided if we kept the mentalistic side, the internal events, separate from the behavioralistic side, external events. And if this were possible, though, why would we even need psychology at that point? He does not deny the importance of private stimuli, quote, but he does ask this important question: what is inside the skin, and how do we know about it? And his answer is radical behaviorism. So from a physiological standpoint, he says we cannot ignore what is inside the skin, but we have to be careful not to confuse what we know with what we think we know. We use language or idioms to make references to internal organs and attribute their functions to our feelings or our mental life. He gives a number of examples of this. The one I liked is like, no, their heart just isn't in it. That resonated with me. He states that science of physiology has its roots in inferencing about what was really going on internally of the body. My own opinion of this from this portion of the chapter is that it seems like Skinner is frustrated by the imprecise nature of language and early science practices. However, he does go on to say that physiology and neurology have made significant progress in identifying and observing actual chemical and electrical processes in the nervous system, but this does not explain observable behavior such as drinking from a cup, identifying an object verbally, or solving a jigsaw puzzle. And we may never directly observe these behaviors in the nervous system because in doing so, it may change the behavior itself. And he refers to this as the Heisenberg principle, something else I had to look up. The Heisenberg principle is actually from physics, and it's also known as the uncertainty principle or the observer effect. And it just basically states that attempting to observe a phenomenon will change that phenomenon, but it stems from physics. Skinner discusses the concept of controlling people with a direct intervention. I believe he was referring to some sort of physical intervention. He doesn't specifically go into what sort of intervention this may be, but does feel that this controversial interventions are used as an argument against the, quote, the control of behavior. But as he states, we already know how effective it can be to change the environment, to change behavior, but this is ignored as proponents come back to the theories of the inner life. He uses a quote that basically says, to free man from common human events that are the difficulties of all humans, they need a bigger brain. And he cites this as an example of demonstrating a very mentalistic approach and argues that a behaviorist would say they need to improve the social environment, which I kind of agree. He concludes this portion of the chapter by looking to the future of what physiology can offer about internal workings of the human and how this relates to observable behaviors. As technology advances, so will the amount of internal observable processes that we can relate those internal processes back to the observable behaviors. And this will not diminish what the science of behavior has accomplished, but will add to it. The mind or the nervous system. Skinner begins with some questions. Isn't it the point of mentalistic view to completely understand behavior? Don't we have a better understanding of the function of behavior and how it was developed over time when internally observing our bodies during this behavior? And lastly, why should we bother to ask about the nature of what is felt or introspectively observed? He states that letting someone comment on the nature of their own behavior is the way of introspective psychology that isn't pure solipsism. I had to look that up too, and that is the philosophical idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. The idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. Nothing else. You can't be sure of anything else, only your own mind. Skinner is looking to recalibrate how to view a person's actions. The word mind, quotes, implies an internal view, but changing that word to brain changes it to a physical thing that we can see, which in turn moves our observations to a person that we can analyze. Skinner states that your senses are limited in their ability to truly observe everything, including your inner self. And he compares how eyes were developed through evolution and the amount of time that took versus self-knowledge, which would begin its evolution much later, starting when humans began to socialize, and so has not yet evolved a corresponding nervous system that would control that. Introspection is dependent upon the nervous system that are already in place, and that Skinner says are already lacking. So with that, it's impossible to truly know yourself internally because the systems are just simply not in place. There are aspects of human existence such as speech, logic, and mathematics that are built on platforms that have evolved over time that are based on survival. The conceptual nervous system. Early physiologists that studied the human body could only infer about things such as synapses because they could not directly observe it. He mentions the integrative action of the nervous system, which I looked up, was a book by British physiologist Charles Sherrington. And the main focus of that was the reflex being the simplest form of the nervous system and the synapse being the location of that reflex. And this formed a foundation for later studies. Eventually, the theories that were inferenced were able to be directly observed once technology caught up. And Skinner suggests that making an explicit model of the nervous system could bring clarity and uniformity to the understanding of it, and he talks about how there are discussions about how the nervous system works without labeling the specific parts. He goes to mention information theory, which is the study of how information is communicated, stored, and counted, and cybernetics, which is a term coined by Norbert Wiener, defined as the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and the machine. And he asked the question, well, would a model of the nervous system not serve until physiology is more advanced? And he says no. His argument against the model is that it encourages those studying behaviors to look at what's happening inside, as in a mentalistic approach, versus observing the tangible environment surrounding an individual, as in a behavioristic approach. Okay, so that does it for the chapter. In my question, he mentioned several times about waiting for technology to catch up to study physiology. Do you think that we are now starting to see some of the advancements that he was hoping for? And what do you think Skinner would say? What do you think he would say about what we've been able to achieve in science and medicine? I look forward to your discussion. Thank you.